Welcome into Sideline Signal. I'm Andrew, as always, joined by my co-host Tyler. With the playoff committee rankings just a week away from dropping, we thought that we would take a chance to look at some of the teams that we deem as bubble teams and kind of go through their resumes, some of their wins, their losses, their schedules that are left to play, and kind of go through to see, are these teams capable of making the playoffs, or are these teams just going to be on the outside of the bubble? How are you doing today, Tyler?
I am good. Obviously, not the way that we wanted it to go for my team specifically last weekend, but a great week of college football nonetheless. And, we're inching closer to finding out what that playoff bracket is going to look like. And I'm excited. So I'm excited to go over these resumes.
Definitely. I'm very excited too. And to preface this for our viewers, we're not looking at teams as they'll probably win their conference championship, but if they're undefeated and then lose in the conference championship, do they get in? Like teams like Oregon, uh, you know, Miami, teams like that. We're looking more towards the teams that maybe are sitting at a loss, or maybe their schedule, they're winning games, but their resume isn't that impressive yet. But without further ado, who is your first team that's a bubble team that you think is very interesting to look at their resume?
So there was a bunch, and Andrew and I went through this before we started recording, and there was a lot of teams that were sitting here like I did not think their resume was this good or this bad. And I'm going to start with one that really seemed to turn around their season from the jump, and that is going to be the number 11, currently ranked number 11, Clemson Tigers out of the ACC. So Andrew and I kind of combed through their schedule. We both sat on and decided that this past weekend's win over UVA was their biggest win, 48-31 there, taking care of business at home. Obviously, they have that loss at a neutral site, Atlanta. Not really neutral for Georgia, though. They got whooped by Georgia in week one, 34-3. And then their toughest games are going to be at number 18 Pitt, which is coming up pretty soon, and then the last week of the year in that rivalry game against South Carolina, which is kind of shaky because you don't really know how South Carolina is going to be, but we kind of put it there because it was a rivalry game. For Clemson, obviously they've been a juggernaut since they lost to Georgia, but this record and this weak ACC schedule, you don't get to play a team like SMU. You don't play Miami in the regular season. Even kind of middle of the pack teams, you're not really playing towards that top there. And the ACC in general has been great this year, aside from SMU, Pitt, Clemson, and Miami. So it's interesting. They're sitting at that one loss. They got to win out. But if they don't win the ACC title game, I don't know if they make it with two losses. It might just have to be they got to win the ACC or that's it. I don't know. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, that's the thing that's really weird is obviously, like you said, they lost week one to Georgia. So it's hard now sitting from the outside, not knowing how these rankings are going to go because the committee hasn't dropped yet. But the way that I see it, if they go two loss, and maybe I'm still in that old fashioned kind of mindset with the 14 playoff where two losses pretty much an eliminator. But when you look at it, there's about like 18 teams right now fighting for those bubble spots. And two, even if they go two loss, which is probably going to happen unless they win out. I mean, they have to, or they will go two loss. But I don't know if that resume is enough. Like you said, looking at it, is Pitt and then probably South Carolina, but realistically, is Pitt going to be enough to get them in as their best win if they lose to Miami? Like, let's say they're fighting for that 12 seed. They're the last team to get in or get out. Depending on their schedule, because Pitt, it's a team we'll talk about in a little too, but Pitt could potentially drop to two loss too. So would a two loss game to an unranked opponent as your biggest win get you over the hump with that loss to Georgia kind of counteract because Georgia's number two in the country right now? I don't know. I mean, Klubnik's played well and Clemson's done everything that they've needed to do, but right now I don't know if they have a strong enough schedule because of the way that they've set it up and the teams that they've played in the ACC. Like you said, they haven't really played anyone tough yet. UVA was probably their best win as of now. So it's kind of weird to look at them. I don't know if I like Clemson's odds if they don't win the ACC.
Yeah, and it really hurts. One game specifically is that win against NC State. It really hurts that NC State is not ranked and is, of course, under 500 or at 500. That hurts them, woefully a lot. Because, you think if NC State beat Tennessee, let's just say they beat it, obviously, massive blowout, but still, if they had won that game and they were ranked and then Clemson did what they did, we'd be sitting here thinking differently. A two-loss Clemson team could probably still make it. But now that NC State has, shown their true colors, they're very mid. Another team that they blew out in the ACC play on the road was Wake Forest. Wake Forest down year for sure. So, they're kind of getting cost here, and it's going to be interesting to see like if this year impacts where they go if they were to move conferences. Because I feel like if Clemson was in the SEC or even the Big 12, they would have a pretty good shot of making it. But then again, they'd have a completely different schedule. So it's going to be not interesting per se, but like just strange to kind of see where they fit. I'm not really seeing the piece to the puzzle unless they win the ACC, in my mind.
Yeah, and one thing I want to ask you, because this is obviously speculatory, because we still could potentially see a few two-loss teams get in, depending on how the rest of the season shakes off. But do you think that this is now a cautionary tale about scheduling these top 10 matchups your first week of the season? Obviously, that loss to Georgia could potentially eliminate them. And looking, like you said before we started recording, LSU plays Clemson, would you say, the next 2 years in
Yeah.
a row? So, do you think that this could be a potential thing that we see less of down the road, team scheduling these top 25, top 10 matchups and they're out of conference play? Because with the realignment, these conferences are getting more and more stacked, like, specifically, like let's say the Big Ten and the SEC. For LSU wise next year, if LSU drop a game to Clemson, they have to play probably 6 to 7 top 25 matchups. So do you think down the road that teams will kind of look at this and be like, all right, we don't want to give ourselves an opportunity to have to play from behind the rest of our season?
That is a fantastic question, and that this is going to be a great conversation. I already feel it. So this really screws the ACC, because you're right. That is a cautionary tale. No one's going to want to schedule Clemson after this, after they play LSU, and even LSU. They schedule USC. They play in Vegas. They lose that game. They had to go perfect the rest of the way. Let's say they had a bye instead of that USC game where they played some bad team, FCS or like in the group of five. Even losing to Texas A&M, they'd still be right in the thick of things if they didn't play USC. So, yeah, I do think so. And I think who gets the short end of the stick here is going to be the ACC. When the Pac-12 kind of builds back, they're going to be screwed a little bit. And Notre Dame. Who's going to want to play Notre Dame? Who's going to want to schedule them since they're not in a conference? I don't see how they're going to be able to keep up. And I think that Notre Dame is going to be forced to join a conference because of this. And it is definitely a cautionary tale. It's one thing if you win this game. It's another thing if you get blown out like Clemson did. That's going to put something in the back of the minds of the committee when it comes to rating them if they are to lose in the ACC title game or a game before that. So yeah, no, I definitely agree. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's kind of always been that way. Like I think back to 2 seasons ago, Oregon schedules Georgia week one, Dan Lanning's first season as head coach, and they got blown out. And for a majority of the season, they were clawing their way back, and then they stumbled and lost to Washington, and then lost to Oregon State the next week. But going into that, I think it's really bad for these teams that I'm just going to use the top 10, maybe top 15 as an example. You really don't have a reason to schedule a top 10 matchup out of conference, especially now if you're in one of the Power Four conferences. Probably I'll just say in the Big Ten or the SEC, because you're going to play for the most part, depending on, there's a few teams that play a cakewalk schedule in those conferences, but like you're realistically going to play 4 to 5 matchups that are top 25. So you're going to get your strength of schedule. You're going to get your strength of record if you win those games. You're going to have what it takes to build a strong resume to get in of the, okay, we had a stumble and we lost and we didn't make our championship game, but we have 6 top 25 wins. I would put that as a strong resume. So there's no point for them. But then I almost see it as it's the only teams that really benefit scheduling these top 10 matchups or top 10 opponents in the early weeks are teams that right now are on the outside looking in, where preseason and probably throughout the season, they're not likely to make the playoffs, but a win week one over a Georgia, a Clemson, and LSU could skyrocket them in just because of that fact. But I don't see a reason for Clemson to do that, especially looking at it this year. No reason to schedule Georgia week one. Because right now, the way that they're going, if they lose one more, they're out. So if they take that loss and let's say they played the Citadel week one and win that. Yes, their strength of record is still really weak. And potentially, you could maybe go into an argument, but if they're sitting at the end of the season, one loss instead of two loss, and their only loss was to Miami, and let's say it's like a 7 point game, they lose by a touchdown to Miami in the ACC championship. That's a lot better of a case for me to put them in as an at-large than a two-loss team where they lost to Georgia in a blowout week one. And so I think it's really bad to see because it's like you said, it is really high risk, high reward. Because if Clemson would have won that, right now they would probably be the favorite and they'd probably be a top five team. But with the loss, I don't see enough on the resume if they get another one to do anything for them.
Yeah, and this is where I hope college football changes. And, obviously, if it were up to me, it would be back to normal. Snap your fingers, it'd be like 2019 all over again. But I hope that it gets to something where we have a super conference where the Power Five or Power Four now teams just play each other. Maybe keep the conferences, but only play other Power Four teams because that's the only way to fix it. Because why would, like, you're completely right. Like, why would you? Well, what do you have to gain from that? So I do wonder what this looks like for the outlook of college football because these smaller schools, especially a team like, I don't know, like, let's say Boise State now, like, they have to play a bigger game because their schedule is going to be weaker. They played Oregon this year. Um, they're going to be looking for an early season out of conference game that's pretty big, I would assume, going forward if they think that they can keep their program at this standard. Who would want to play Boise State? There's no reason. There would be no reason. So I would like either to incentivize scheduling those games somehow, some way. I don't know what that would look like, or create that big conference to eliminate, the weakness in the schedule and make everyone play a strong schedule, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's really weird because, like you said, some of those group of five schools definitely need those big wins. And it's funny because you bring up Boise State, and to me, Boise State are one of the few teams that are benefiting from a loss right now. Obviously, you look at a lot of these group of five schools that are fighting for that automatic qualifier. And for the most part, like Navy lost this weekend to Notre Dame. And in the eyes of pretty much everybody, right now, Navy's probably eliminated from making the playoffs. And it's funny that, obviously it would be drastically different if that game against Oregon was a blowout rather than a 3 point game because they took Oregon, who's now the number one team in the country, right down to the wire at Autzen Stadium. So it's really funny to me that a team like Boise State right now is almost considered as an undefeated team because of that. So it's really interesting just to look at the whole scope of scheduling these tougher opponents, and it's hard until we get to these rankings to see how the committee favors or dislikes them. And obviously, we'll see for a team like Clemson how that loss to Georgia is factored in because obviously week one is always hard. You kind of just take it as it is because teams are drastically different by this point in the season than they are week one. Like we'll use LSU as an example. That loss to USC wasn't looked as that bad of a loss week one. It was unfortunate, but it was two good teams. But now you look at it, and USC, what are they, 4-4 after beating Rutgers? And
Yeah.
so you lose week one to a 4-4 team, and it looks exponentially worse than it was when you lose week one. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that. But I don't know if there's a lot of teams that are benefiting from losses to top teams as much as Boise State is. But I want to look at another resume because it kind of goes along with Clemson as a team that might be able to win their conference, but it still could be very interesting to see because of the way that their conference is kind of shaking up. I'm going to the Big 12. You can give me your thoughts on the Big 12 as well, just as a whole, but really specifically Iowa State, because the way I looked at it with Iowa State, right now, their biggest win probably is still the Cy-Hawk game, where they went off a last-minute field goal to now 5-3 Iowa. But other than that, I mean, they haven't really played a tough team. I mean, you can make an argument maybe that West Virginia, perhaps, and then they had a close one against UCF, who's a two-win team. They had to have a last-minute touchdown to beat UCF at home. And then obviously looking at the remainder of their schedule, They go to Utah. Utah's 4-4 with not the best season, obviously quarterback issues, but they're going to Rice Eccles, which is known to be hard to play at. And then they end their season off with Kansas State. And so the way I look at it is right now, there's a chance that if Kansas State wins out and beats Iowa State, K-State would play BYU, barring any BYU upsets in the Big 12 championship. So if we're looking at a one-loss Iowa State who don't make it to the Big 12 championship, do you think they have enough on that resume to get in?
I personally do not. I don't think so. And the only way that I could justify it is if they lost to K-State by like three on like some freak thing. That's kind of where I'm going with that. Like it's got to be razor thin. The it's got to be a really close loss for me to put them in. And it's terrible because I love the Big 12. I love the chaos of the Big 12. I love how we have these teams that are undefeated in Iowa State and BYU, but somehow yet they're not in the top echelon of teams. And then you got a team with one loss in K-State where they got blown out by BYU, but have looked good every single other week, barring this last week against Kansas. It's just like a crazy conference. And then you look at Colorado finally getting the respect. They get in the top 25. Not many of us expected them to be able to do that. But they have a sneaky backdoor way in, and that's kind of what I wanted to touch on. But no, to answer your question, no, I don't think that a one-loss Iowa State gets in without a Big 12 title game appearance or, championship. But Colorado, really interesting. If let's just say, Iowa State loses to Utah, BYU picks up a loss somewhere, and K-State, and then Iowa State beats K-State at the end of the year, right? Colorado's got a path even with two losses. I mean, they're at Texas Tech. That's not going to be an easy game this weekend. Then they host Utah. Then they're at Kansas. That should be a win, but Kansas, of course, is capable of playing better. And then they're hosting Oklahoma State to end. If they go and win out, and they're a two-loss team, and they have a chance, obviously, to if they finished with a better record than K-State, have a chance to get into that Big 12 title game. They would need K-State to lose twice, I guess, not just once, because K-State has the tiebreaker, obviously. But do you think that, like, even slightly in your mind, do you think Colorado can do this and run the table and become a piece, a cog in this playoff picture?
It's interesting. The way that I see it right now, though, probably no, unless they win the Big 12. Because I don't know if I mean, Colorado has some good wins in this schedule, but I don't know if you can necessarily justify some of their close losses or their just closer games as a whole. Like, I go back, North Dakota State week one. Again, hard to take week one games outside of the pocket of its week one, but 5-point win over FCS North Dakota State, who are a powerhouse. And I think it's major props to North Dakota State that they were able to hang with now a top 25 team. But then you look at like a 7-point win over Baylor week four. Not that big of a win. You'd want a bigger win out of a game like Baylor. And obviously they've lost to Kansas State. So it's kind of tough. I don't know. Again, I agree. Obviously the loss to Nebraska too. So they need those two teams. They need Kansas State to be as good as they can, but obviously they need K-State to lose so that they can get into the title game. But I don't know as an at large, but it's going to be really interesting because, like you said, there is a slight path for them to make it to that title game. But again, do you think that they could beat BYU right now? I don't know. But Kansas State have looked shaky, so there is a chance they can get an upset, and then Iowa State could beat them. There's a chance Iowa State could lose to Utah. There's a genuine path that they could make it. I don't know if they would win it, but the ultimate decider will be this game against Texas Tech, who's been a hard team to get a read on. They've had games where they've looked really good, some where they've not really looked like anything competitive. So it's going to be interesting. I think Colorado will ultimately beat them, but in terms of getting an at-large pick or like being on that bubble, I don't think that they would have a shot to get in because I think there's too many teams right now in better conferences that are sitting on the outside looking in or right now just on the graphs of being inside. Too many good SEC teams, too many good Big Ten teams. I would probably argue some of the ACC teams right now could potentially be above them. But going back to Iowa State, I think Iowa State's in for a rude awakening if they aren't able to win out and go to the Big 12 championship. If they lose to Kansas State, I think there's a serious shot they get left out because I don't think that the Cyhawk can be considered a good enough game. It's similar to like what we said with Clemson, if Clemson go two loss. I don't know if they have enough on their schedule to justify it because Iowa, now they're 5-3, they're unranked. They're not really looking that good, but that's your biggest win. And if you lose to Kansas State, then your argument, okay, what's your next best win in conference? Is it Utah? I don't know. And I really don't like their odds. And it's going to be interesting because it could come down to two of these teams. Would you take a one-loss Iowa State who didn't play in their championship game? Or would you take a two-loss Clemson that lost to Miami in the ACC championship?
If I had to pick between those two, I would have to go Clemson. They've just looked like the better team in general, and that we've seen that. We have seen that. We saw that last year. Florida State, great year, but how did they look in the ACC title game? That's why they were left out ultimately. That does play into it, but of course, Andrew and I, we don't know until these rankings come out. So that would be a heck of an argument for both, and someone's going to be really, really disappointed at the end of the night when they find out that they're not going to the playoff. But I would personally would have to go with Clemson there. I also wanted to touch back on BYU for a second while we're talking about the Big 12. I don't want to ambush you here, so I'll read off the schedule that they got left. So they're undefeated right now. They definitely, by far, have the best resume of any Big 12 team. They beat SMU early in the year, week two. They beat SMU on the road 18-15. That was a nail biter. And then they crushed K-State at home 9-38 there. They also have a 6-point win over Baylor on the road, which is the kind of the shaky one, as well as a 3-point win over Oklahoma State there as well. They go to Rice Eccles this week, the
Next
Holy
week,
War.
bye
Uh,
week.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. It's next week. And then they host Kansas, then they go to Arizona State, and then they host Houston. So my question is to you, does BYU have to go undefeated in the regular season to be in? Because I think they would be in even if they lost the Big 12 title game. But even if you disagree, please let me know. But if
No,
they
I
were
agree
to
with
lose
that.
one of these games before the Big 12 title game and still make it and then lose that,
Yeah,
or
I think the way that I see it, I think they have to go undefeated in the regular season. I those are potential resume exploders if you lose some of the easier games down the road. Obviously, Rice Eccles for the Holy War, it's going to be a good game. It's rivalry game. It's always big. Those two teams hate each other. It's always hard when you have to play that away. But that could just completely root them out. Where if they lose a regular season game, in my eyes, they have to. They have to go and win the Big 12. But I will say, I still think if they go undefeated and lose in the Big 12 title game, I think they'll still get in as the at large. I think that win over K State is massive. And now looking at it again, it's the inverse of LSU with that loss to USC. That win over SMU, you now need them to be as good as they can. But they're a top 25 team right now. So that's really good for their resume. So I think if they go one loss, but it be in the Big 12 title game, they get in as an at large. But if they go two loss, and let's say it's to Utah, it gets a lot tighter because there's some teams that we still have to talk about that are sitting on the outside in that if they're equally two loss, I think the other teams that we have yet to talk about will get in over them. And I'll kind of segue that now to one of them. Let's say a team like Texas. And the reason I'm saying Texas, obviously Texas still have a path to the SEC title game, but they have to play A&M the last week of the season. If I'll go through kind of what my notes right now that I have for Texas, questionable what their biggest win of the season is. Is it Michigan when they played, who's now sloppy? Is it UL Monroe, who's one of the better group of five schools? Is it Oklahoma? Is it that 3-point win at Vandy that they just had? Hard to say. And obviously they've lost to Georgia, but right now that's a team that is on the outside looking in for the SEC title game. Their toughest games left are Arkansas on the road and Texas A&M on the road to end off the season. So, first of all, before you get into it, give me your thoughts on Texas's resume, what you think they need to do to get in. Do they have a shot if they go two loss? But then also compare that. If we have a two-loss BYU, who lose in a regular season, lose in the Big 12 title game, outside looking in. Come down to it, would you take them over a two-loss Texas who doesn't make it to the SEC title and loses to A&M week 8, the last week of the season, or maybe beats A&M but loses to Georgia again in the SEC title game?
Wow. Wow. I would hate to be on the committee because that situation is all likely. That could very well happen. So I want to break it down here. So the first scenario you mentioned is BYU loses in regular season and the Big 12 title game, and then Texas loses to Texas A&M. Doesn't make the SEC title game, and then has those two losses. In that scenario, I would take Texas, simply because they've looked better. Um, you know, I hate to say the aesthetics of it because that's so dumb. That's not what college football should be, but that's what the committee has gone off of in the past. Texas would compete better against the bigger teams. I just plain and simple, that's how it would be. They have the talent to match just about anyone in the country, and that's kind of why I would favor them. However, if BYU were to just flat out lose in the Big Ten, Big 12 title game and have that one loss, and then Texas beats Texas A&M but loses in the SEC title game, has that two loss, I would have to lean on the side of BYU. And I think that the committee would still put Texas in over BYU. I actually think that probably both of them would make it. But if we're looking at those two teams specifically, I would go with BYU, because unless Texas blows out Texas A&M, they haven't had a game where you can look at it, and I guess Oklahoma, but Oklahoma's clearly not very good. Where you go, all right, this team was dominant. And BYU has that win. Yes, sure, it's at home, but over a K-State team that looks pretty damn good. So, you got to go like your biggest win, but also what's your best performance? BYU had their best performance in their biggest win. So that's kind of where I would give the leaning there. What do you think? Like, what's your opinion on this?
It's hard because obviously every year it's a newer committee or there's some moving pieces within the committee. Last year they went heavily on some of their crucial decisions on just an eyeball test. Which team do we think would be more competitive compared to which team deserves it more? So I think that's the hard part right now is we need to see if the committee favors the analytics, the strength of schedule, strength of record, more numeric values rather than just the eyeball test, or if again they favor the eyeball over the stats. Um, so that's kind of the thing that we have to wait and see. If they both are two loss, I think it's very difficult because, like you said, and that was a great point, BYU's best performance came in their biggest win. And so that's kind of the proving that when they played their toughest games, they were able to compete at the highest level that they have all season. And, you can justify them to get in, but let's say it came down to Texas and BYU, both two losses it's kind of hard to not give a slight nod to Texas because if you look at their losses, this is where it comes down to which losses are more favorable. Would you rather have them lose to, let's say, a loss to Iowa State and a loss to Utah? Is that better than losses to Georgia and Texas A&M or Georgia twice? I don't know because you can make the case that a team could still be deserving of making it to the playoffs if their two losses are to the best team in the country or a top three team in the country, where the other team lost to a 500 team and a top 10 team. It's hard because BYU's done everything right currently, but they could potentially get screwed. And that's the thing is we don't know until we find out what kind of committee we're playing with. Are we playing with the eye test committee or are we playing with the analytics? Because analytics might favor BYU. And if BYU go one loss, I still think it's a tough conversation. If they win out in the regular season and they lose in the title game to let's say Iowa State or Kansas State or Colorado, whomever, it still is hard because there's these SEC teams that might get left out of their conference championship game. You almost have to kind of make a case for them because it's like they lost two games and aren't in the conference championship, but their two games are to the conference champion and the conference runner up, or just two top 10 teams in the country. Do we value these high ranked losses more than just one loss to a good team? It's hard, and we won't know until the committee kind of presents themselves as what kind of committee they are.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Are we going 2 for 1 on losses? Like that's kind of how the way that I think of it is that do you count that Georgia loss and then a possible loss to either Texas A&M or Georgia again as like a half of a loss? But I will say that one thing that is going against Texas, well, obviously the schedule, the fact that Michigan is no longer considered that top flight of team, and that Vanderbilt obviously, since they beat them, is no longer ranked, is the fact that in their loss to Georgia, they should have lost that game by a lot more than 15 points. If I'm going to be completely honest, it was a slop fest. They looked horrible. Quinn Ewers looked terrible. Then you put in Arch and he looked terrible. They couldn't get anything going. And are we going to just chalk that up to being, oh, it's Georgia's defense? I don't think you can do that. I don't think you're allowed to do that when we're talking about the playoff because Georgia has a loss. It would be completely different if Georgia was undefeated, blowing out every team, but they lost to Alabama, who has 2 losses. So, are we kind of discounted? Like that is going to be huge. It would also be different if Texas went to overtime against Georgia. And yeah, sure, it's 15 points, but like I said, it's a lot longer of a 15 points than a normal 2 possession game. So that is something that plays into it as well. I really feel so. This is going to be I could not imagine being in that war room deciding this.
Yeah.
Even at the first preliminary rankings. Like crazy.
Yeah, because there's so like, and you have to take into consideration too that some of these positions are probably already filled, barring any crazy upsets. Because, obviously there's five of the 12 teams that are guaranteed. You get your group of five automatic and your four conference champions. But you have to kind of assume that, let's say it's Ohio State, Oregon in the Big Ten. Ohio State knocks off Oregon. You have to assume Oregon's going to get in. So that's one position gone. I would argue that the SEC runner-up will probably automatically get in. If Miami lose in the conference title, they would get in. So there's probably three guaranteed right now of the six that's remaining. Then there's probably the teams we're listing right now. There's probably 9 to 10 teams that are fighting for three spots. So it's going to be really, really hard. I don't know, dude. This is, like you said, I agree. I would not want to be in the war room. And this is a lighter slate of games this week, so I'm not expecting a lot of upsets. Most teams should kind of just fill themselves in. But yeah, I have no idea how it's going to go. And there's still a few teams that are, left for us to talk about that we haven't covered yet, that it's like they have a path, but do they? And it's really slim pickings out here. Like a team, I'll stick with the SEC, like Tennessee. Tennessee have a big win over Alabama. They have I would argue their win at that point in time against Oklahoma is big too, but they lose to Arkansas on the road. Big win for Arkansas. Arkansas, I would say, is a team that's better than their record. Been kind of the team that could almost play spoiler and have played spoiler. They still got to play Georgia at Georgia, and they still got to play Vandy. Do they have a chance?
So if they beat Georgia, they're in my mind, even if they were to lose to Vandy. They'd be in if they beat Georgia on the road. If they make, uh, well, if they beat Georgia, they'll be in the SEC title game, I would assume, right? I don't really know what the math is even looking like right now.
Yeah.
I mean, Texas A&M's leading the conference. Then you got Georgia, Texas, you know, Bama, LSU right under there, Ole Miss. So they're all right there. So Tennessee, they control their own destiny for now. They beat Georgia. I got them in with 2 losses. If they've lost a third, then no. But if they beat Georgia, I would assume that they're in the SEC title game. But if they lose to Georgia, like I said earlier with Clemson, NC State just crapping out is going to cost them dearly. Yes, they won that game by 41 points, but NC State is not good. Not even close to what we thought they were going to be. And Oklahoma, yeah, they beat Oklahoma, but they beat Oklahoma by 10 points where Texas beat them by 31. So that is going to be huge as well because if you look at it in Texas, let's say Texas loses to Texas A&M last week of the year, they don't make the SEC title game. Tennessee wins at Georgia, or no, loses to Georgia but wins out, doesn't make the SEC. That last spot, that 11 seed, that 12 seed, depending on where they put Boise State or the group of five champ, it could very well come down to these two teams that we're talking about right now. So in that scenario, you can only have one in, and I'm putting you right on the spot, and this is going to be a tough one to answer. Which one? Which one? In that hypothetical that I just had, Texas loses to Texas A&M and Tennessee loses to Georgia, but they win out besides that. And there's one spot left, and we're going to say that one of these two definitely makes it. Which one would you pick?
I think to me, it depends on how Tennessee lose to Georgia. If Tennessee lose in a nail biter, it's by a field goal, but they were there the whole game. I think you have to give the edge to Tennessee because you look at the comparable game
Wow.
and
Yeah.
it would be Tennessee over Texas. But it's hard. It really is hard because like I don't know, dude. Yeah, because I mean Texas, I don't know, dude. They didn't impress in that game, and they don't really have a big win yet. And if they lose to A&M, that would be their big win. But if they lose there, it's hard to justify because yes, okay, Tennessee got upset against Arkansas. Tennessee would need Arkansas to be the best team. They need to win Arkansas to win out so that resume loss doesn't look as bad.
They play Texas.
They do. They do, which would then eliminate. But yeah, okay. So they would need them to win every game besides Texas, unless Texas loses to Arkansas. But then that would
Yeah.
itself out. Obviously, I'm rambling, but yeah, they would need Arkansas to be as good as they can be to end off. But again, I think it comes down to it. You look at a comparable loss, and you look at it, and the two right next to each other. If Tennessee play a way better game against Georgia than Texas did, I would almost feel like you have to put them in because if you look at it too. I would argue that their win over Alabama would also justify putting them over because Bama beat Georgia. You played Georgia to almost beating them. Texas, you lose to A&M, and then you got beat in a game where the stats don't show the full story. You got dog walked by Georgia. I would put Tennessee in. And yes, they've been sloppy. Nico at times does not look that good. I think you'd have to justify it. I think you really would.
Okay.
But it's
Okay.
hard. Like it's also coming to the point where it's like, do we punish teams for playing in their conference championship too? You know, if they get an extra loss in like a championship game, where do you put them?
Where
And
do
this
you
is
put them?
another one that I was just thinking of right now. If Army go undefeated, they beat Notre Dame, they beat Navy twice, win the AAC, and they win, the Army Navy game. They go 13-0. Boise State win the Mountain West. They finish 12-1. They win out. Could you justify putting a 13-0 Army in as an at-large or a 12-1 Boise State in as the at-large and Army in as the group of five qualifier?
As crazy as it sounds, if we're looking, uh, I'm trying to think who would get subbed out. As crazy as it sounds, like that would rival, like Army's resume would rival a team like Tennessee's. And even be like, if Tennessee was two loss and Army's undefeated, and Boise State, like you said, has that one loss to Oregon on the road by 3 points. I would say that Army gets the group of five and Boise State would be the at large. Because I really feel like and this is going to be out of left field here, but I feel like if Miami doesn't win the ACC title game and Boise State has that, I think you leave Miami out because their resume is not good. They're like because I think the SEC survives because they play enough tough games. Like even the worst SEC team they play, Vanderbilt or Arkansas, is still Vanderbilt or Arkansas. Arkansas could have been ranked a couple of weeks ago. Like,
Yeah, and you can
it's just
honestly you
wild.
can make the case too of the actual bottom feeders. Like Mississippi State have played close games against the
Yeah,
top SEC teams. Kentucky's second to last in the SEC. They beat Ole Miss.
it's a buzzsaw.
Yeah,
A buzzsaw. And that is why in when I was 10 years old, That is why I signed up to be an LSU football fan. Because every single week it's cinema. It's cinema. It never stops. And yeah, it's given me close to a heart attack like at least once or twice a season. But it's worth it, dude. I mean, with the Pac-12, with the old Pac-12, every week it was like, are we gonna win? Are we gonna lose? Like we're playing a worse team or a better team, but you never know. And that is the greatness of college football. But it is going to punish the committee for sure.
And
So
it's
I don't know. What
hilarious.
do you think what I said is justified? Like, do you think Boise State couldn't be the at large over like a team like Miami if they were to lose? Because like you just touched on it, losing in the conference championship game, does that count as a half a loss or a full loss? Like what are we saying here?
That's the thing is, I don't know with a team like Miami, and I agree. Miami's resume is kind of fraudulent. You barely beat Virginia Tech, a game you should have lost. They should not have overturned that Hail Mary, you know. Then they barely beat Cal, you know.
Cal, they were down 25.
Yeah. 25 points comeback against Cal, which I guess you can make a case. Well, hey, they showed resilience. They faced adversity and got a win on the road. Maybe. I don't know. But it's like that. They struggled against a Louisville team that is just a turnover machine. They're not that good. But again, is if they lose to Clemson in the ACC championship after being undefeated in the regular season, I don't think that's enough. I think a team like if Army was the G5 qualifier and Boise State was going in for an at-large, I think that they would have you would have to make a case to put them in over a potential two-loss team that's on the bubble. A one-loss, maybe not. It's hard to say, but if you're a two-loss team, I don't know. I don't feel like you could it's tough because the AAC isn't that good of a conference. It just isn't. It's not one of the best group of five conferences. But if you beat Notre Dame, who right now, it's not a team we'll cover, but it's a bubble team for sure. They're a team that's still fighting for that at large. If they beat Notre Dame and then they beat Navy twice, who was previously top 25 before their matchup against Notre Dame, can you make that case? And then again, it would be the same thing. Like if it was between them and like Texas, who's two loss, both of their losses to Georgia, would you take the 13-0 team from the group of five, or would you take the team that's lost twice to Georgia? I don't know. And I was going to say this. It's funny because when we started recording, I thought I had a clear sense of how this was going to go. And in my mind, like, okay, these are my teams that I think are easily in the. I'm at the point now, I don't think
I
any
don't know.
team is safe. I don't think
Yeah.
there's a single team that's safe in college football right now to make this playoff.
No, no, and this is kind of a pretty good segue. I wanted to touch on them. We have to talk about it. This team over here in Bloomington, Indiana, the Indiana Hoosiers, the Fighting Signettis over here, number 13th in the country. They're undefeated. They played basically nobody. They beat Nebraska at home by 49, which was their biggest win. Nebraska had a good showing against Ohio State, almost pulled off the upset. But a team that's undefeated plays no one except they go to Columbus in a couple of weeks to play Ohio State, which could be weighted down if Ohio State loses to Penn State this week. Like, I think there's a chance that Indiana goes undefeated. Well, actually, no, you said this before. If Indiana went undefeated, it would be guaranteed that they played in the Big Ten title game.
So
Do you mean
as
that?
things stand, if Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana all win out, this is subject to change depending on how the last few weeks of the season play out. But at the current moment, if the season ended today and all teams won out, they're on even. So like, if they all win out and the rest of the teams, just are like null and void, they don't play each other. Penn State doesn't play Indiana. Oregon doesn't play Indiana. Penn State doesn't play Oregon. None of them play each other in head to head. So they don't have the head to head tiebreaker. So it would come down to common conference opponent records. So all the teams that they played collectively, that each of the three teams played, they all played those teams. Their overall records, it's some weird stat, but it's like the record of the teams that they've played gets collected. And right now, if the season ended and they all won out, Oregon would be the team left out of the Big Ten championship for Indiana and Penn State because they have a better opponent record, which is bananas. But I don't know. But yeah, Indiana is a very, very interesting team. Looking at them, if they were to lose to Ohio State, if they win against Ohio State, I think no matter, as long as if they win the regular season out and go undefeated, I think they're in no matter what, whether they win the Big Ten, lose the Big Ten. They beat Ohio State, I think they're in. But if they lose to Ohio State and don't make the Big Ten championship, What happens with them in your eyes?
I said this when we did our playoff prediction a couple of weeks ago or last week. Um, no, that's not going to cut it for me. That's really not going to cut it. Their biggest wins would be actually, I got to pull up their schedule right now, but as of right now, it'd be Nebraska and Washington, both at home. They haven't played a tough road game besides obviously Ohio State. So let's look at it. So what they have left, they travel to East Lansing. They play Michigan State this weekend, which will actually be a tough game. So we'll see what they're made of there. Michigan State's not an amazing team, but they're solid. Then they host Michigan, which would have been a game day game, but now it's just another Big Ten game. Then they go to Columbus and then they host Purdue in that rivalry game for the Oaken Bucket. I think that's what the trophy is called. I love that game. But like they even like let's say Ohio State gets blown out by Penn State this weekend, drops all the way down to like 15. I don't know if that does it. I really don't. I'm stuck on this, dude. I think they have the worst resume of any of these teams that we've talked about. And I think that even if they went undefeated and missed, it would say they just miss out on the Big Ten title game, and Ohio State's two loss, maybe even three possibly, if they were to like lose to Michigan. It doesn't do it for me. Even with one loss, it doesn't do it for me. And it hurts me because they are America's team right now for 100%. Like everyone's rooting for them. Everyone wants to see what they do. But they haven't been solid. They have been solid, but their scheduling is terrible. Like if they played a game, if they played, well, USC's in conference. So let's say they played, I don't know, let's say they played Pitt week one and neutral site. That would benefit them so much.
Yeah.
So much. So we're looking at a team that's a victim of their schedule. They couldn't control it. It was the Big Ten. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's weird with Indiana. It really is because it almost feels like neither sides of a certain committee would play them any favors because right now, yes, they're undefeated, but like you said, their schedule's not that good. So I don't know if necessarily the eye test committee would get them in because of who they played. But then again, you look at the analytics and you look at strength of record, strength of schedule. They're undefeated, yeah. And if they lose to Ohio State, that's going to hurt them in strength of record. But is this a schedule that really is good enough? And that's the thing. I think if it's more of an eye test committee, I don't think they have a shot getting in unless every single team that is on the bubble goes two loss, maybe even three loss. Then you kind of like by proxy, you put them in. But I don't know. I don't know right now if they get in unless they make the Big Ten championship. Because as unfortunate as it is to say, we're kind of at the point in college football where it's not that you earned it, it's if you're good enough to compete. And again, you make the case. They have all the momentum. The whole country's behind them. It's America's team. It's a good story. But are they going to be able to beat a Georgia in the first round of the playoffs? Are they going to be able to beat a Texas team? One of these teams that are probably going to be an at large. Are they going to be able to beat Clemson? Maybe. If they get lucky in schedule, like if Iowa State get in and they play Iowa State, that's a team that they might have a shot against. But are you going to, if Oregon lose to Penn State or Ohio State in the Big Ten championship, is Indiana going to be able to beat Oregon on the road? I don't know. I don't think so based on what they've shown with their resume. And like you said, it's a great point. It's hard to punish a team for their schedule because of they don't really get the opportunity. Obviously, they build their schedule, but how are they to know? You know? And so it's hard because they're doing everything right and they've done everything that they've needed to do. But are we at the point where they can contend? I don't know yet. I really don't know. And I think, again, it's really going to come to how they play against Ohio State, and then they would need Ohio State to be as good as possible. If they
Yeah.
lose to Ohio State and then Ohio State go and win the Big Ten, and it was a 3-point loss to Ohio State, then you make the case. Then you can actually have an argument. But if Ohio State doesn't make the playoffs, or if they go two loss and get in as like the last team as an at large, I don't think you can sneak Indiana in if they lose.
And the worst part about this, and it hurts me to say this, because like it's kind of my last question here for Indiana specifically.
Yeah.
I see their resume if they both end the season undefeated and Indiana doesn't make the Big Ten title game somehow, or if they do and they lose, I see it as good as Army's. I really do.
Yeah,
Notre Dame, Notre Dame, Ohio State, they're both top 10 teams. Both have one loss when they're playing them. So
yeah, and that's the thing that's hard too, is because I think the real travesty for Indiana is just that their conference schedule isn't good. And obviously, looking at it at the preseason, Michigan, that looked like a big game. You could have made a case maybe Washington or Michigan State could have snuck in and had a good season. Obviously, they didn't. So the fact that they have a weak conference schedule is ultimately what's going to hurt them. Because we just had a long discussion about, is it worth scheduling these top 10 teams or big matchups early in the season? Not really. But this is, like you said, if they would have scheduled a team like Pitt and won, that would help them a lot because their non-conference games were FIU, who's not good. They're two wins as a group of five. They beat them 31-7. They played Western Illinois, who's an FCS team. They beat 77-3. And
the
then Charlotte.
worst,
What'd you say? Sorry.
the worst
Yeah.
FCS team,
Yeah,
Western Illinois.
exactly. And then they go and win 52-14 over Charlotte. So their resume is just not good. And it's only going to be good if they can beat Ohio State. But at the same time, if I agree that I would argue that it almost rivals Army if they were to win out, but it's tough because do they deserve it? Record wise, yeah, but you could make the case to put some two-loss teams over them, and I think the world would be fuming at that. But I think it could be justified.
We've seen what good stories do in the playoff. We saw it with Cincinnati. They got in, they got clapped by Alabama.
Yeah,
We saw it with TCU. Crazy game. They beat Michigan. What happens in the in the national championship? We've
yeah.
seen feel good stories and we've seen how they play out, and that's really going to be the argument. I really think so.
Yeah, but you and I are on different ends of the stick with the TCU one.
Oh,
I think that they deserved it. They beat
yeah.
Michigan, so
No, I
that was
agree.
the proving ground. Yeah, but yeah, it's going to be really hard to kind of judge them. And again, this is where we're going to see them. I mean, the committee's going to put them higher because they're currently undefeated. We know that. But the committee rankings come the Ohio State game. How is the committee going to favor them? I don't think they favor them that high.
I could see them dropping to like if they lost to Ohio State, even if it was close, I could see them dropping to like dropping to like 17, some
Yeah,
spot like that, like
yeah.
completely out of it.
It's gonna be hard because, like I said, I feel like I'm in an echo chamber of saying it, but there's so many teams right now that are still fighting for this bubble, and hopefully, in a few weeks when we kind of come back and do another resume review once we get the committee rankings, hopefully some of these question marks will kind of figure themselves out, and we get closer and closer and start getting a slimmer pool for this bubble. But right now, dude, like I said, there's like 12 teams
Wide
fighting,
open.
12 to 20 teams, probably not 20, 12 to like 15 fighting for six spots. All of them have a case, all of them don't. And I think the final one we should end off on is a team right now undefeated in the ACC, but kind of still plagued by that ACC resume, curse. It's Pitt. Right now, again, we look through it. Biggest win was probably that dominant win over Syracuse, where Kyle McCord looked awful, three pick sixes in the first half. But you get at home, you get a big win. And they have two tough games left. They go and they play SMU this week, which is a top 25 matchup, and they play Clemson. Do you think wins over SMU and Clemson, but then a loss to Miami in the ACC title game, is that enough to get them in?
I actually think it is. I actually do think it is. And it's tough because, I've sat here and said this with other teams like, oh, no, that's not going to do it. But I think for them, it does, but only if SMU only loses to Pitt, like, and Clemson as well. If they beat both of those teams, yeah, but both of those teams have to be two loss, you know?
Yeah.
Um, they have to be the best because Pitt, if they go undefeated and lose in the ACC, I view them the same as BYU if BYU lost in the Big 12. And I don't think we've given the respect to Pitt because they haven't been in big games yet, but here we go. I mean, this weekend at SMU is probably their toughest game. No offense, Clemson. It's just that Clemson's at home. So this is going to be a rocking environment. SMU knows what this means. I'm sure they do. I guarantee you they know that this is the biggest game of the season for them specifically. And even SMU's got a path as well. So like, it's just wild, but I think it does. Do you agree, disagree? What do you think?
Uh, I don't know anymore. I thought I did before we started recording. It might. I think it might be enough. And again, it all depends on how these games play out. Again, if it's a close loss to Miami, I think they're in no matter what. If they get blown out by Miami, it's a lot harder of a
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah,
But
no.
it's funny because they're almost similar to Indiana. But the thing for me is with Pitt, they're playing a tougher conference schedule than Indiana is. Indiana only have the one right now against Ohio State, but Pitt, they got to beat a good SMU team who, again, one of their losses right now is to BYU. So this is a very solid SMU team. And then you got to play Clemson, who right now are one of the favorites to get in as a bubble team. So if they can win both of those, I don't see why not. And again, it comes down to it. If they're a one loss, can you punish them for losing in their conference championship game? And I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions when we come to the final committee rankings. Once we get to conference championship week on Selection Sunday, are some of these teams that are fighting for the bubble, are they going to be punished for losing in their conference title game? And I think that's the hardest thing. But I think Pitt could get in. I think Pitt will get in if they can beat Clemson and they can beat SMU and then lose to Miami. I think they'd get in.
Well, my question to you, since you touched on it with Indiana, are we counting SMU number 20 in the country on the road and then home against number 11 Clemson over like which one would you value more? Those two wins together, one on the road and one at home versus a one win at Ohio State. If they both, let's say they both go to their respective title games and lose in horrible fashion, and they're the last team, like kind of similar to what I said, Tennessee and Texas. I know it's a really hard question, but I mean it makes for good conversation. So
I mean,
I want to hear it.
I think for me, the question would be, I don't know. I'd still give it to Pitt, I think. Obviously, the win over Ohio State is probably, well, I don't know, because would the win over Ohio State be bigger than the wins over Clemson and SMU? Because what happens, like you said, if Ohio State lose to Penn State this week and then lose to Indiana, they fall apart. They're three loss.
Okay.
The third loss being to Indiana. Is that win as big? I don't think so. So then I think Indiana need Ohio State to be as good as they can be the remainder of the season, but then beat Ohio State. Or if they lose, they need Ohio State to win the Big Ten. So if Indiana win against Ohio State, they need them to lose, they need them to beat Penn State for them to have a shot. Then it's a bigger argument. But if Penn State beat them and then Indiana beat them and they're a three-loss team with Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana as their losses, I will almost would take SMU and Clemson as bigger games.
Okay.
But I think it would still come into play their losses in their championship games too. If Indiana play, let's say it's Oregon. No, I don't even think I don't know. It would depend. Either they might still not get in. It's hard to say. We don't know. But I'll take it in the vacuum. If it's Oregon, Indiana, and that's a close game, but then Pitt get blown out by Miami, then you have to favor Indiana. But if they're both close, I don't know. I think I would still take Pitt.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a solid answer.
I don't think there's a single right way to put it right now. And again, this is the hard part about doing it before we get the initial committee drops because we don't know how any of these teams are valued. We could be
Yeah.
way off the mark, you know?
Yeah.
Like SMU could be a top 10 team in the country for all we know. They won't be. I'll be the first to say they won't be, but they could be. We don't know. And that's the biggest question mark is what are teams going to be valued next Tuesday?
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a wild world that we live in. It's ever changing. But one thing is for sure, college football is awesome. And
It
this is
really
just
is.
another representation of it.
It really is. And, it's great for nerds like us who are sitting here with 17 different theories every single day of what could happen, who's going to get in. I love it. I know you love it. It's great. For the fans that are listening, we appreciate you listening to us ramble. We'll have videos like this down the road once the committee rankings start to come out, trying to make more sense of it. Be there along the way with us. We'll try our best to keep it concise. But this has been another episode of Sideline Signal. I'm Andrew, as always, joined by my wonderful co-host Tyler. Get out, watch some football this weekend. It's going to be great. Try your best to keep up with it. We are. But make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe to us. If you like more short form content, we also are on TikTok at Sideline Signal. We do a lot of posting weekly there, so make sure to follow us. Let us know if you subscribe through our YouTube. If you follow us on TikTok, let us know that you came from YouTube. We'd love to hear that. But other than that, I think that wraps up our episode. Thank you all and have a good one.